Hey, before we start, I picture a tent zipper. Not torn, not ripped open in one motion. Inching. A quarter inch at a time. Slow enough that you could count the pulls, like something on the other side wanted him to notice. There was no wind that night. No raccoon leaves a zipper alone once it starts and then stops. He never explained how something outside knew to pause exactly when he stopped breathing. He survived that weekend, but he hasn't camped alone since, and when people ask why, he changes the subject fast, the way people do when they've already decided not to talk about it. His name doesn't matter much here. Call him what his sister called him, which was stubborn, and call the reason he was out there what it actually was. A divorce that had gone through 6 weeks earlier. Papers signed in a lawyer's office that smelled like carpet cleaner. And a silence in his apartment that felt louder every night. He needed to be somewhere that wasn't that apartment. A state park 2 hours up into the mountains. One he'd been to a dozen times before. Felt like the easiest kind of nowhere. Familiar trails. A campground host who knew his face. Cell service that came and went depending on which way the wind was blowing, which he'd always found kind of funny before. He got there in the late afternoon, backed his truck into the same gravel loop he always used, and did the things a person does when setting up camp for the first time in a while. He staked the tent down at the corners, checked the rainfly even though the sky was clear, and laid his sleeping bag out flat to unroll the wrinkles before dark. He cooked instant noodles on the little camp stove, ate them too fast because they were too hot, and called his sister while he still had 1 bar of signal, standing near the fire ring with his phone held up like that made a difference. She asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. He was starting to believe it. By the time the fire burned down to coals, the sky had gone that deep mountain black, where you can actually see the stars doing something, moving or shimmering, or just being brighter than they have any right to be. He zipped the tent shut, checked it twice out of a habit that had nothing to do with fear yet, and lay there, listening to the woods settle into whatever woods do at night. Somewhere, out past the tree line, something moved through dry leaves in a slow, deliberate circle. He lay still and listened to it, complete 1 full loop around the tent before it stopped. Raccoons did that. He'd seen them at this exact site before, bold little things that came sniffing around a cooler if you left the lid loose. He told himself that's what it was, rolled onto his side, and let himself drift, because a person can only stay alert for so long before the body just decides to sleep whether the mind agrees or not. The second night was different, and he knew it was different almost immediately, the way you know a room has changed even with your eyes closed. The footsteps weren't circling this time. They were pacing, back and forth along one side of the tent, slow, deliberate, stopping at the same 2 points each pass like something was checking the ground or checking him. He lay with his eyes open in the dark, listening to fabric rustle where the tent wall brushed against nothing that should have been there. Then, something exhaled. Close. Close enough that he felt it more than heard it. A warm breath against nylon just inches from where his shoulder was pressed to the tent wall. He didn't move. He'd tell people later that not moving was the smartest thing he did that whole trip, though, at the time, it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like his body had made the choice before his mind caught up. The zipper moved an inch. Not torn open, not yanked. Just an inch, slow. The little metal pull sliding along its track with a sound too soft to be anything but deliberate. He grabbed it from the inside before it could move further and held it shut with his fist, heart going hard enough that he could feel it in his ears. Outside, the pacing stopped. Whatever had been moving along the tent wall went still, and the stillness was somehow worse than the noise had been, because stillness meant it was listening too. He remembered something then. Something the camp host had said 2 mornings earlier while he was filling his water jug at the spigot. Something so small he'd nearly forgotten it. "Don't leave food smell on your hands before bed," the man had said, wiping his own hands on his jeans like it was the most basic advice in the world. Wash up good, especially this time of year. He'd taken it as ordinary bear country advice. Standard stuff, the kind every ranger station posts on a laminated sign. He hadn't thought about it again until he was lying in the dark with his fist locked around a zipper pull, running his memory back over the noodles he'd eaten with his fingers because he'd forgotten a fork. That was before the voice. It came low, almost gentle, from somewhere just past the foot of the tent, and it said his ex-wife's name. Not a name close to it. Not a sound that could be mistaken for wind moving through branches. Her actual name, said the way you'd say it if you were calling someone in from a porch, easy and familiar, like whoever said it had said it 1,000 times before. There was no one at that campground who knew her name. He hadn't told the host. He hadn't told a single soul on this trip who she was, not even in passing, because that wasn't a conversation he was ready to have with strangers. He lay there with his fist still locked around the zipper, and for one long, terrible second he almost answered. His mouth almost opened. Something in him wanted to say her name back, wanted to ask who was out there, wanted an explanation more than he wanted safety. He didn't answer. He held the zipper shut with everything in him and stared at the ceiling of the tent until the black canvas started turning gray, and the gray started turning gold. And somewhere in that slow shift, the woods went back to being ordinary woods, full of birds and wind and nothing that should have known her name. He didn't sleep again that night. He lay there with his fist aching around the metal pull, listening for footsteps that never came back, and somewhere around 5 a.m, he allowed himself to loosen his grip. When he finally unzipped the tent at full daylight, the grass around it was wet with dew, and pressed into that dew, circling the entire perimeter of the tent, were footprints. Bare. Human-shaped, or close enough to human-shaped that his first thought was that someone had been walking around him barefoot all night in October cold, which made no sense at all. He followed the prints with his eyes, circle after circle, waiting to find where they broke off and led away into the trees. They didn't. Every print looped back into the next one. Whatever had walked around his tent all night had never actually left. He packed up fast, hands shaking in a way he blamed on the cold, and drove the loop past the camp host's little trailer on his way out. The man was sitting on his step drinking coffee, same as every morning, and when he mentioned, carefully, almost embarrassed to bring it up, that something had circled his tent all night, the host didn't look surprised, didn't ask what it looked like, didn't offer an explanation. He just nodded slowly, like he'd had this exact conversation before, and told him to drive safe. He never got a straight answer about what had been out there. He never figured out how it knew her name. All he knows is that he hasn't camped alone since, and some nights, lying in his own bed with the windows locked, he still catches himself holding his breath, waiting to hear if anything answers back. The next account comes from a couple who rented a cabin for their anniversary, the kind of place you find online with a handful of photos and a review count in the double digits. What happened to them didn't come with footprints or a voice in the dark. It came slower than that, from inside a wall that wasn't supposed to lead anywhere. They'd been married 3 years, and money had been tight enough that a real trip was out of the question. So when Maggie found a cabin listing 2 hours into the mountains for $80 a night in the off-season, it felt like a good compromise. Wood stove, clawfoot tub, a porch that looked out over a ridgeline in the photos, though the photos, they'd later realize, hadn't shown everything. They arrived just before dusk, tires crunching up a gravel drive that hadn't seen a grader in a while, past a hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post that just said, "Private," in faded red letters. The cabin itself looked exactly like the listing. Squat, log-sided, a chimney already breathing thin smoke because the owner had apparently started the stove for them ahead of time. A small kindness that made the place feel less like a stranger's property and more like somewhere they were meant to be. They unloaded groceries onto a countertop that still smelled faintly of pine cleaner. Dan got the wood stove built back up while Maggie found the key rack, the folded quilt on the bed, the little laminated instruction card taped to the fridge about the generator and the well pump. Ordinary cabin things. They ate cold sandwiches, standing up because neither of them wanted to bother with the stove yet. And once it got properly dark outside, Maggie found the guest book on the side table by the couch and started flipping through it by lamplight, while Dan checked that the front door actually latched, because it hadn't quite sat right when he'd closed it the first time. The frame was a little warped, the kind of thing old cabins just have, he figured, and he didn't think much more of it. The guest book was mostly what you'd expect. Families thanking the owners for a peaceful weekend, a couple who'd gotten engaged on the porch, someone's handwriting complaining cheerfully about the mosquitoes in June. But near the most recent entries, right where the next blank page should have started, there was a jagged edge instead, a page torn out, cleanly enough that whoever did it had used some care, not ripped in a hurry. Maggie held it up to the lamp like the light might reveal something. "Somebody didn't want us reading whatever they wrote," she said, half joking. Dan glanced over from the stove. Probably left their number for a hookup or something. People do that. It made sense. It was the kind of thing that happens at cabins like this. Someone leaves contact information they regret later, or writes something too personal, and a friend or the owner tears it free before the next guests can see it. Maggie set the guest book down and didn't think much more about it either. That was the thing about the whole evening, looking back. Everything had an easy, ordinary explanation right up until it didn't. They found the back bedroom around 9, when Dan went looking for extra blankets. It was down a short hallway past the bathroom, a door that should have opened into a second bedroom according to the floor plan on the listing. Except the door didn't open. Not locked, nailed. 4 long nails driven at angles through the frame and into the door itself, old enough that the heads had gone dark with rust, but done with intention, not decay. A strip of masking tape below the handle read, in handwriting gone soft with age, "Storage, do not use." "Weird," Dan said, running a thumb over one of the nail heads. "Guess they just use it for junk." It was a reasonable thing to think. Old cabins accumulate rooms like that. A space that used to be something and got repurposed, boarded up because it was easier than fixing whatever was wrong with it. He found the extra blankets in a hall closet instead and didn't mention the room again that night. They spent a good hour after that doing what people do in a cabin with no service and no television, talking, half listening to the wood stove tick as it cooled, watching lamplight move across log walls that had absorbed 40 years of wood smoke. It was, up until the knocking started, a genuinely good night. The kind they'd come there for. The first knock came from somewhere behind the kitchen wall. 3 slow raps, evenly spaced, the sound duller than a knuckle on a door, more like something knocking on wood from the inside of a cavity, muffled by insulation or distance. Dan looked up from his book. "Pipes," Maggie said, before he could even ask. The listing mentioned the plumbing's old. It was a fair guess. Old cabins knock. Pipes expand and contract with heat. Air gets trapped somewhere, and the whole system groans and taps at odd hours in a way that sounds almost purposeful if you're tired enough to notice. They'd both grown up in houses that did the same thing. Dan went back to his book. Maggie went back to her phone, scrolling through photos with no signal to send them anywhere. The knock came again exactly 1 hour later. Same 3 raps. Same spacing. So precise that Dan actually checked the clock on his phone before and after, and the 2 times lined up close enough that it unsettled him in a way he didn't say out loud. Pipes don't usually knock on a schedule. He got up and pressed his palm flat against the kitchen wall where the sound seemed to come from, feeling for a vibration, a pulse of water moving through the old copper. He felt nothing. The wall was just cold, plain drywall over log, and when he tapped it himself, testing, the hollow sound it gave back didn't match the deeper, duller knock they'd both just heard. He didn't say anything to Maggie about that. He told himself he'd tap around more in daylight, when it would be easier to find whatever pipe was rattling loose behind the plaster. That felt like a reasonable plan. It let him go back to the couch, back to his book, back to a version of the evening where everything still made sense. What he didn't mention, what he barely let himself think about, standing there with his palm still faintly cold from the wall, was that the sound hadn't come from the kitchen side, the side facing the well pump and the pipes that fed it. It had come from the other side. The side that backed up against the hallway. The side that, as far as either of them could tell from the floor plan, backed up against nothing at all except the nailed shut door and whatever was on the other side of it. The knocking wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the wall it was coming from didn't lead anywhere. They didn't talk about the wall again that night, not directly, but Maggie noticed Dan checking his phone for the time more than usual, and Dan noticed Maggie glancing down the hallway every time she got up to refill her water glass, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that an hour was a strange amount of time for a pipe to wait between complaints. She heard her name a little after midnight. Dan had gone out to the truck for something, just for a minute, leaving her alone by the stove with the lamp turned low. It came from the direction of the hallway, not loud, not urgent, just a soft, almost affectionate whisper of her name, the kind of tone you'd use to wake someone gently. She sat frozen on the couch with her water glass halfway to her mouth, waiting for it to happen again, telling herself it had been the wind finding a gap somewhere, or her own mind playing tricks after a long day of driving. When Dan came back in stamping cold off his boots, she almost didn't tell him. She told him anyway, because not telling him felt worse. Probably the wind, he said, but he said it too fast, the way people do when they want to believe something more than they actually do. They tried the landline after that. An old rotary phone bolted to the kitchen wall. More decoration than function these days, but the listing had mentioned it worked for emergencies since cell service didn't reach the property. It took 3 tries to get a dial tone and 2 more to find the caretaker's number written on a card tucked behind the phone. A man answered on the 4th ring, voice rough with sleep. Dan kept it simple. Said they were hearing some knocking. Wanted to know if there was something loose in the walls he should know about. There was a pause on the line long enough that Dan thought the call had dropped. Then the caretaker said, flat and fast, "Don't go near that door." And before Dan could ask which door or say anything else at all, the line clicked dead. They stood in the kitchen for a while after that, not saying much, the receiver still in Dan's hand making its little off-hook whine until he finally hung it back on the wall. Outside, the wind had picked up, and what had been a clear, cold night when they arrived was starting to smell like snow. By 1 in the morning, it was snowing hard enough to blur the porch light into a soft orange smear, and the single-lane gravel road they'd driven in on had already gone white and featureless. The generator, which had been humming steady in its little shed since they arrived, coughed twice, and died sometime around 1:30, taking the porch light and the kitchen light with it, leaving them with 2 lamps running on batteries and the last of the fire in the stove. Neither of them said the word trapped, but they were both thinking about the drive-in, about the narrow shoulder on either side of that road, about how a truck with summer tires and no chains was not going to make it back down a snow-covered mountain grade in the dark, and about how the nearest neighbor, according to the caretaker's card, was 4 miles off. Dan found the fresh dust sometime around 2, when he'd gone back to check the nailed door out of nothing but restless nerves, needing to be doing something instead of sitting still. The tape across the frame was undisturbed. The nails were exactly as rusted and immovable as before. But at the base of the door, where the wood met the frame, a thin layer of dust that had clearly been sitting there for years, the kind that builds up on furniture nobody moves, had been disturbed. Not from outside. From the inside edge, a faint, smudged arc, like something had dragged along the seam from the other side of the door, testing it, feeling for a gap that wasn't there. He didn't tell Maggie right away. He stood there a long moment with the lamp in his hand, staring at that smudge, running through every explanation that made sense, settling wood, an old draft, mice, and finding that none of them accounted for the shape of it. It didn't look random. It looked deliberate, like a hand tracing the inside edge of a door frame to see if it moved. He went back and told her anyway, because the alternative was carrying it alone, and he didn't think he could. They didn't decide to test it. He'd say later that it wasn't a decision at all, more like something his hand did on its own. 3 knocks against the kitchen wall, in the same rhythm they'd been hearing all night. An experiment he regretted the second his knuckles left the drywall. It answered. Instantly. No delay, no pause for consideration. Just 3 knocks straight back at the exact same spacing, sharp enough that Maggie's water glass rattled where she'd set it on the counter. Neither of them knocked again. They spent the rest of the night in the front room with every lamp they had gathered around them. Batteries be damned. Sitting on the couch with a blanket over both their laps and their backs to the wood stove instead of the hallway, watching the dark space beyond the kitchen doorway like it might do something if they looked away. The knocking didn't come back. Something worse happened instead. It went completely quiet, quieter than it had been all night. The kind of silence that feels occupied rather than empty. And they sat inside that silence until the windows finally began to lighten with the gray of an early mountain dawn. The snow had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving 4 inches of clean white across the drive, unbroken except for their own tracks from the night before. The road, impossible in the dark, looked almost manageable in daylight. But before they left, Dan checked the front door, the same door he'd locked twice from the inside before they'd gone to bed, the same door neither of them had opened once during the night, and found 3 faint scratch marks low on the inside panel. Thin, parallel lines in the old paint, the kind that could have been made by fingernails, or by something with a similar idea of what fingernails were for. The caretaker showed up around 9, plowing the drive himself in an old pickup with a blade welded to the front, and when Maggie held up her phone to show him a photo of the scratches, he barely glanced at the screen before looking away entirely. "You weren't supposed to hear that," he said, and that was all he would say, no matter how many ways they asked. They checked out early, paid in full without complaint, and didn't look back at the cabin as they pulled onto the gravel drive. Snow crunching under tires that had somehow made it through the night without needing chains after all. Months later, out of some impulse Maggie couldn't quite explain to herself, she pulled up the listing online to see if anything had changed. It had. The floor plan was the same. The porch, the wood stove, the clawfoot tub, all exactly as they remembered. But the photo gallery that had once shown 5 rooms now showed 4, and the back bedroom, the one they'd never once seen the inside of, wasn't in the listing at all anymore. as if it had never been part of the cabin to begin with. The next account moves off the mountain and onto the road, from a man whose job was simply to deliver propane to a house at the end of a lane with only one way in and out. His name was Ray, and he'd been driving the same delivery route for 11 years, which is long enough that a job stops feeling like a job and starts feeling like muscle memory. Twice a month, he covered a loop of family properties scattered along the backside of the county, places too far off the main road for the big trucks to bother with, places that depended on guys like him showing up on schedule before winter really set in. Dispatch had flagged one stop that morning as a shortcut he hadn't taken before, an older route down what the map app called Miller Hollow Road, narrower than what he usually drove, but faster, and with a storm coming in that afternoon, faster mattered. He topped off at the last gas station before the signal dropped, bought a coffee that tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since morning, and pulled a paper map out of his glove box out of habit, because his phone had already started stuttering between one bar and none, and he'd learned a long time ago not to trust GPS out here past a certain point. The road wound down into the hollow fast, gravel giving way to dirt in places where the county hadn't graded in a while, trees pressing close enough on both sides that the truck's mirrors nearly brushed branches on the turns. He noticed the man at the first curve almost by accident, a shape at the edge of his vision as he took the bend. Barefoot, standing at the tree line in what looked like work clothes, not moving, not waving, just standing there the way a person stands when they're waiting for something. Ray lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in the small habitual wave you give anyone you pass on a road like this, a courtesy more than a greeting. By the time he glanced in the mirror to see if the man had returned it, the curve had already swallowed the view, and there was nothing behind him but empty road and trees. Local, probably, he figured, out for an early walk or checking a fence line, though the bare feet in October cold struck him as odd enough that he kept turning it over as he drove. People did strange things on their own land, though. He delivered to enough remote properties to know that normal stretched a lot further out here than it did in town. The second curve came almost 2 miles later, the road doubling back on itself the way these hollow roads sometimes did, following the shape of the creek below, rather than any straight line a person might expect. And there he was again. Same man, same stillness, same bare feet planted in the cold mud at the edge of the gravel, watching the road rather than watching Ray specifically, as if he were waiting for the truck rather than for him. Ray didn't wave that time. His hands stayed on the wheel, and he found himself checking his speed without meaning to, the truck creeping up past what the curve really allowed. There was no way to get from the first bend to the second one on foot that fast, not through terrain that steep, not without a road he could see and use himself. He told himself there had to be a shortcut path through the woods that locals used, some deer trail cutting the distance in half. It was the kind of explanation that worked fine right up until he reached the delivery. The homeowner was an older man named Hollis, out on his porch waiting like he always did when Ray's truck came up the drive, watching him hook up the tank with the particular attentiveness of someone who'd been burned by a careless delivery once and never forgot it. Ray mentioned it while he worked, mostly just to fill the silence. Said he'd seen a fella out walking barefoot along the road, twice now. Wondered if that was somebody from around here. Hollis went still, in a way that made Ray look up from the valve. "You didn't stop for him, did you?" Hollis said, not looking at Ray, looking instead down the drive toward the road, like he expected to see something there. Ray said no, he hadn't stopped, just waved the first time. Hollis nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's relieved about something he doesn't intend to explain, and told Ray to finish up and get on his way before the weather turned. That was all he'd say. Ray asked, half joking, if there was something he should know about that stretch of road, and Hollis just repeated himself, quieter this time. Don't stop for him. The drive back down the hollow felt longer than the drive in, though the map said it was the same distance either way. Ray kept the radio off without deciding to, some instinct telling him silence was easier to listen through than static. The clouds had come down low and gray by then, the kind of flat mountain light that swallows shadows and makes everything look the same distance away. The third sighting came at the last curve before the hollow opened back onto the county road, and this time the man wasn't standing at the tree line at all. He was standing in the lane, directly in it, closer to the truck than either of the first two times, close enough that Ray could see the stillness of him in a way he hadn't quite registered before. Not the stillness of someone standing and waiting, but something closer to a held breath, a stopped clock. And behind Ray, in the mirror, the road he'd just come down no longer looked like it curved back the way he remembered. It looked like there was only the one way through now, and the man was standing in the middle of it. Ray didn't break. He'd think about that decision for years afterward, replay it more times than he could count, and he never came to any conclusion other than that some part of him had already decided, faster than thought, that stopping was the one thing he could not do. He kept his foot steady, kept his eyes forward, and did not look at the mirror again no matter how badly some animal part of his brain wanted him to check what was behind the truck. The engine held, the road held, and somewhere in the space of a breath, the curve was behind him, and the county road was ahead, wide and gray and ordinary, and there was no one standing in his mirror when he finally allowed himself to check it. No shape at the tree line, nothing at all. He called it in to dispatch that evening, more to have it on record than out of any real hope they'd tell him something useful. There was no report of a pedestrian on Miller Hollow Road, they said. No one had called anything in. When he tried Hollis's number a few days later, hoping for some kind of explanation, the line rang and rang with no answer, and it kept ringing every time he tried after that, as if the man had simply decided the conversation was finished before it started. The only thing that didn't fit, the detail Ray still can't explain, showed up on the gauge cluster before he'd even made it back to the shop that day. His propane truck ran a separate fuel gauge for the delivery tank, one he checked out of habit at the start and end of every route, and according to that gauge, a measurable amount had been used on a stretch of road where he swore, on anything a person could swear on, that he had never once idled the engine. He still drives that county. He's had 11 years to find a different route around that hollow, and he's never taken it. But he turns the radio off now, every single time, well before that first curve, and he doesn't turn it back on until the road opens up wide and flat and ordinary again on the other side. The next account comes from a ranger who worked a closed trail outside a small mountain town, and it's the kind of story that made a lot of people at that station a lot more careful about which sections they logged and which they didn't. Tom Whitfield had been a park ranger for 19 years by the time this happened, long enough that very little about the woods still surprised him. He'd pulled hikers off ridgelines in lightning storms, tracked lost kids through fog thick enough to swallow a flashlight beam, and dealt with more bear encounters than he could count on both hands. He was not, by his own account, a man who scared easily. That's worth knowing going in, because what happened to him afterward, he says, still doesn't sit right. And he's the first to admit that a man who's seen what he's seen shouldn't still be thinking about one afternoon on a closed trail years later. The section in question had been shut down for 3 weeks after a storm took out a footbridge and destabilized part of the switchback above it. Routine stuff. Tom's job that morning was simple: hike the closed loop, log the damage, check for any hazard trees that needed marking, make sure the closure tape at both trailheads was still intact and nobody had ducked around it, He'd done 100 checks just like it. He filled his thermos with gas station coffee that had gone lukewarm by the time he reached the trailhead, radioed the station to confirm he was heading in, and started up the trail with his logbook and a roll of fresh hazard tape in his pack. The first mile was unremarkable. Downed limbs here and there, a section of trail washed into a shallow gully that would need regrading before it reopened. The ordinary aftermath of a bad storm in steep country. He was marking a leaning oak near the second switchback when he saw the backpack. It sat dead center on the trail, upright, straps neatly tucked, the kind of small kid's pack with a cartoon animal stitched on the front pocket. Tom stopped where he was and looked at it for a long moment before approaching, the way you look at anything that doesn't belong somewhere it shouldn't be. The trail had been closed and taped at both ends for 3 weeks. No hikers should have been anywhere near this section, let alone a child. He crouched down next to it, and something about it started nagging at him before he could put a name to why. The fabric was clean. Not a little clean, completely clean. No mud, no leaf litter, no sign of 3 weeks of exposure to rain and wind, and everything else this section had taken in that time. It looked like it had been set down 5 minutes ago. His first read on it, the one he wrote in his log that afternoon, was that someone had ignored the closure recently and left it behind. Maybe doubled back for a forgotten item and would come looking. It was the reasonable explanation. It was also the one that let him keep walking instead of standing there turning it over in his hands, which is what he really wanted to do. He radioed it in, gave the location, said he'd keep an eye out and finish his sweep. The dispatcher on the other end didn't have any missing person reports on file for the area, which didn't surprise him. Closures got ignored more often than people like to admit, and most of the time nothing came of it. He kept moving up toward the canyon section, the steepest part of the loop, where the trail ran along a rim above a drop that required rope gear to access from below. It was a stretch he always paid extra attention to, because a fall there wasn't the kind you walked away from. The storm had knocked a good bit of debris down into that canyon, and he was picking his way along the rim, checking the integrity of the trail edge, when he heard the whistle. 3 sharp blasts, evenly spaced. The exact pattern rangers are trained to use when signaling a location during a search. Not something a random hiker would know, not something that happened by accident. It came from below him, from somewhere down inside the canyon itself, a section that no untrained person could reach without climbing gear, and that no trained person had any business being in without a coordinated team and a permit Tom hadn't been told about. He stood at the rim for a long moment, straining to hear it again, but the canyon had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a sound rather than the kind that was already there. He called down anyway, out of habit more than expectation, identified himself, asked if anyone could hear him. Nothing answered. He logged it. Precise coordinates, description of the sound, time it occurred. It was the kind of detail you wrote down because that's the job, not because you expected it to matter. Back at the station that evening, he mentioned the whistle to the 2 other rangers on shift, half expecting one of them to have a simple answer. Maybe a search team practicing signals somewhere nearby, maybe a hunter who knew the pattern from somewhere else. Neither of them offered one. Both of them went quiet in a way that made Tom notice, the kind of quiet that isn't the absence of an answer, but the presence of one nobody wants to give. He checked the missing persons database himself before he left that night, cross-referencing the county and the surrounding districts for anyone reported lost in that section, current or historical. Nothing matched. No open case, no recent report, nothing that would explain a search whistle coming from inside a canyon that hadn't seen an official operation in longer than Tom had worked there. He drove home that night the way he always did, and he didn't think much more about it until he pulled the small backpack's tag out of his jacket pocket the next morning. The one he'd bagged and brought back as evidence out of nothing more than procedural habit. He hadn't looked at it closely the day before, too focused on logging the location and getting through the rest of his sweep before the light went. Now, sitting in his truck outside the station with his coffee going cold in the cup holder, he turned the tag over and read the name stitched into the fabric in faded, careful thread. A name that meant nothing to him at first, until he ran it through the station's old records and found the file. It matched a missing child's report from decades earlier. A hiker, technically, though the file listed the child's age as 7. Last seen on that same trail, in that same canyon section, in a search that had gone on for 11 days before being called off without a body ever recovered. No missing person report matched anyone current. That was the first thing that hadn't sat right. What he found instead was worse, and it was the kind of detail that made Tom Whitfield, 19 years into a job that had taught him not to scare easily, sit very still in his truck for a long time before he finally started the engine and drove home. He brought it to Dale the next morning, the oldest ranger at the station, a man who'd worked that district for going on 30 years and had trained half the current staff himself. Tom laid it out plain: the backpack, the tag, the old file, the whistle from a canyon nobody could reach without gear. He expected some kind of explanation, even a bad one. What he got instead was Dale setting his coffee down slow and asking, quiet, which section of canyon exactly. When Tom told him, Dale didn't say much of anything for a while. He just looked out the window toward the ridgeline like he was deciding something. "We don't log calls from that section anymore," he finally said. "Haven't in years." Tom asked why not, and Dale only shook his head and said it wasn't his story to tell, that Tom should let it be, that some sections of this park had a way of taking care of themselves, and it was better for everyone if the rangers just let them. Tom didn't let it be. He tells people now that he wishes he had, though he says it in the flat, tired way of a man who knows the wish doesn't change anything. It was 2 days later, on a routine radio check with the station, that the static on his handheld cleared for a half-second and produced a call sign. Not garbled noise, not crossed frequencies, but an actual unit designation, spoken clear as day before the static swallowed it again. Tom recognized it. Every ranger who'd worked that district more than a decade would have recognized it. It was the call sign of a search unit that had been formally retired and decommissioned years before Tom had even started the job. The radios themselves long since stripped for parts or scrapped entirely. He sat in his truck with the handheld in his lap for a long time after that, turning it over, checking the battery, checking the frequency dial, finding nothing that explained what he'd just heard. He went back to the canyon alone 3 days later. He'll tell you now that going alone, against every piece of protocol he'd followed for 19 years, was the worst decision he made in this whole thing. And he made it anyway because some part of him needed to see the section for himself in daylight, needed proof of something before he let his own mind convince him the whistle and the call sign had been nothing at all. He reached the rim just as the light was starting to go gold and low, that late afternoon slant that makes everything in the woods look longer than it is. He stood there a while, looking down into the canyon, at the tangle of downed trees and boulders far below, at a drop that no 7-year-old could have survived, that no grown adult could survive without ropes and a harness, and a team above them managing the line. He keyed his radio to check in with the station, a routine call, nothing more. Before he could finish pressing the button, before a single word left his mouth, the whistle answered him. 3 sharp blasts, exactly the pattern, coming from somewhere below the rim. Close enough this time that he felt it more than heard it. The sound arriving from a place his radio hadn't even reached yet. He didn't call out. He stood at that rim with his thumb still on the radio button and looked down into the canyon. And for one long stretch of seconds he became aware, in a way he couldn't fully explain afterward, that something down there was aware of him too, not watching in the passive way an animal watches, waiting, the kind of stillness that has intention behind it. He backed away from the rim slowly, radio still gripped in his hand, and made his way back down the trail without running, though every part of him wanted to. He didn't look behind him. He'd tell you that not looking behind him was another decision that mattered, though he can't say exactly why he believes that. Only that it felt true in the moment, and still feels true now. The next morning, back at the canyon with 2 other rangers present this time, in full daylight, they found a single boot print in the mud partway down the canyon slope, mid-drop, on a section of rock face that no one could stand on without climbing gear, pressed into ground still soft from the last rain. One print. No trail leading to it. No trail leading away. Nobody at the station would say much about it. The trail was rerouted the following season. The old switchback and canyon rim closed permanently. The official reasoning listed as erosion and structural instability, which was true enough on paper, if not the whole truth of it. Tom never used that trail's old name in a report again. He says it wasn't because anyone told him not to. He just didn't want it written down anywhere with his name attached to it, in case someone else went looking for it the way he had. The next account moves out of the woods entirely, into a small mountain town with 1 diner, 1 waitress, and a road that doesn't exist on any map you can buy. The man's name doesn't matter to this one either, mostly because he never gave it when he told the story. And the diner where it happened is the kind of place that shows up on a map as a dot with no real name attached. 1 gas station and 1 blinking light holding up an entire town's worth of business. He was passing through on a work trip, driving out to inspect a property 2 counties over, and he'd stopped for breakfast the way anyone does on a long drive through unfamiliar country, because the diner had a lit sign and a full parking lot. And a full parking lot in a town like that usually means the food's worth trusting. He took a booth near the window, ordered eggs and coffee from a waitress whose name tag read Carol, and settled into that particular kind of morning quiet you only get in small towns, where the loudest sound in the room is a spoon against a mug and the low hum of a radio behind the counter. He read a copy of the local paper somebody had left on the counter, made small talk with the cook through the pass-through window, checked his phone for a signal that came and went depending on where he stood. It was easy, unremarkable, the kind of stop you forget about within a week under normal circumstances. He'd taken a wrong turn on the way into town. Nothing dramatic, just a fork in the road where his GPS had glitched and sent him briefly down the wrong branch before he doubled back. He mentioned it to Carol while she refilled his coffee, mostly out of idle curiosity, asking if she knew a road called Old Kessler that he'd passed a sign for. An actual painted road sign, weathered but legible, sitting at the mouth of a narrow gravel track that hadn't shown up on his GPS or the paper map folded in his glove box. Carol's hand didn't stop pouring, not at first, but it slowed. Just enough that he noticed. She topped off his cup, set the pot down on the counter behind her instead of carrying it to the next table, and said, without quite looking at him, that she didn't know any road by that name. It was a small enough thing that he almost let it go. Almost. But something about the way she'd said it, too flat, too quick, the practiced tone of someone giving an answer they'd given before, made him push a little further, ask if maybe it was an old logging road, unmaintained, the kind that wouldn't show up on current maps, but might still have an old sign standing from decades back. She changed the subject, asked if he wanted more toast. When he brought it up again a few minutes later, a little more directly this time, she changed it a second time. And that was when he understood, in the plain, obvious way you understand things after the second dodge, that she wasn't confused about the road. She knew exactly what he was talking about, and she didn't want to talk about it. He let it sit for a while, finished his eggs, watched the town wake up slow through the window. A truck idling outside the hardware store across the street. A man in coveralls loading feed sacks into a truck bed. The ordinary rhythm of a place that had been running the same way for longer than he'd been alive. It was Carol herself who finally came back to it, setting his check down on the table with a look that had shifted from careful to almost concerned. "There's a reason nobody names that road on paper anymore," she said, quiet enough that the cook in the back couldn't have heard it. "You didn't turn onto it, did you?" He told her the truth. He'd turned onto it briefly, maybe 50 yards in, just far enough to find a spot wide enough to back the car around and correct his mistake. It hadn't felt like anything at the time. A narrow gravel track running back into thick trees, nothing on either side but woods pressing close. The kind of road you find all over these mountains and think nothing of. Carol went quiet again, but this time it wasn't evasive. It was the stillness of someone deciding how much to say. She asked, careful, if he'd heard anything while he was turned around back there. He hadn't thought about it since it happened, hadn't even registered it as strange in the moment. Too focused on getting his car turned without putting a tire in the ditch. But now that she'd asked, he remembered it clear as anything. A voice, or something close enough to a voice, calling out from the tree line while he was backing up. A short phrase in a rhythm and cadence that didn't sound like any language he recognized. More like a fragment of something older, worn down by repetition into just a handful of syllables. He said the phrase out loud, best he could remember it, more to see if she'd recognize it than anything else. Carol's face changed. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there a second before. She told him, flat and final, not to say it again. She wouldn't explain why. She said only that it was an old expression, one that had been passed down in families around here for longer than anyone could trace. Tied to a warning nobody fully explained anymore, because nobody fully remembered the reason behind it, only the rule itself. You don't repeat it, and you don't answer it if you hear it called back. He paid his check, left a good tip, and canceled the site visit 2 counties over without much of an excuse beyond feeling like he needed to head home instead. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't stop at the diner again on his way back through, taking the long way around the town entirely rather than risk passing anywhere near that gravel track a second time. Months later, curiosity got the better of him one slow evening, and he found the county's local historical society had digitized part of its old photo archive online. He searched the town's name out of nothing more than idle interest, and there, in a black and white photograph dated 50 years earlier, was the same road sign, same faded lettering, same tilt to the post, standing at the mouth of the same narrow gravel track, in a photo taken decades before he'd ever driven anywhere near that county. He called the diner once more after that, hoping Carol might finally explain what the phrase meant, what the sign's history was, anything at all. The man who answered the phone had never heard of a waitress named Carol working there, not in the 10 years he'd owned the place. He still doesn't know what the phrase meant. He just knows not to repeat it out loud, not even as a joke, not even years later when the memory feels distant enough to almost laugh about. Some habits, once a person learns them, don't ever really go away. In the next account, this one from 2 brothers cleaning out their late grandfather's cabin off an old coal road, follows a quieter pattern at first, right up until it doesn't. Their grandfather had been gone 6 years by the time Caleb and his younger brother Wyatt finally made the drive out to the old homestead, a task they'd been putting off for longer than either of them wanted to admit. The land had sat empty since the funeral, too far off the main road to interest most buyers, tucked back up an old coal camp access road that hadn't been maintained by the county in decades. Their father wanted it cleared out and sold before another winter did any more damage to the roof, and since neither of their schedules had lined up until now, it fell to the two of them to spend a long weekend sorting through a lifetime of their grandfather's belongings. The drive-in took longer than either of them remembered. The old coal road narrower and rougher than their childhood memory of riding up it in the back of their grandfather's truck. Wyatt brought his dog, a scruffy mutt named Biscuit, who usually rode with his head out the window the whole way, and it was the dog who gave them the first small sign that something about the day wasn't sitting right, though neither of them thought much of it at the time. They pulled into the gravel clearing in front of the cabin a little before noon, the whole property looking smaller and more overgrown than either of them remembered. Kudzu creeping up one side of the porch, the tin roof gone rust orange in patches, the whole place sagging slightly the way structures do when nobody's lived in them long enough to keep the small problems from becoming big ones. It was ordinary neglect, the kind any inherited property accumulates. They set to the work of it, the kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your mind occupied enough that you don't dwell on the fact that you're going through your dead grandfather's things, airing out the cabin by propping open the windows, sorting his old tools into keep and toss piles on a tarp laid across the porch, checking the generator in the shed to see if it would still turn over after all this time sitting idle. It didn't, not at first. Caleb spent the better part of an hour fiddling with it, cleaning out the carburetor, checking the fuel line, muttering the kind of quiet frustration you save for machines that used to be reliable and no longer are. Wyatt worked inside, going through drawers and closets, finding the small artifacts of a life, old photographs, a pocket knife worn smooth from decades of use, receipts for things that had stopped mattering years ago. Biscuit wouldn't come inside. Wyatt noticed it around mid-afternoon, called the dog up onto the porch a few times, and each time Biscuit hung back at the edge of the truck bed instead, ears low, refusing to move any closer to the cabin than that. It struck Wyatt as odd, but not alarming. The dog didn't know this place, had never been here before, and a strange property full of unfamiliar smells was reason enough for a cautious animal to hang back. He left the dog to it and went back inside. Rain started up in the late afternoon, the kind of steady mountain rain that settles in and doesn't hurry off, drumming against the tin roof in a rhythm both brothers found almost pleasant after a while. A sound they associated with childhood summers spent up here before their grandfather got too old to host them. They ate a late lunch standing at the kitchen counter, listening to the rain, and it was, for a while, a good afternoon. Sad in the way this kind of task always is, but not unsettling. That changed a little before dusk, when Caleb finally got the generator sputtering to life and stepped back out onto the porch to catch his breath, and heard, faint but unmistakable over the rain, a whistle. 2 notes, rising, then falling. He knew it the instant he heard it, the way you know a song you haven't heard in years but could still hum from memory. It was their grandfather's whistle, the specific 2-note call he used to summon them in from the woods when they were kids playing too far from the cabin, a sound so particular to the man that neither brother had ever heard anyone else make it quite the same way. It came from uphill, from the direction of the old mine entrance that sat maybe a quarter mile back into the tree line, boarded up as long as either of them could remember, part of the same coal operation that had brought their family to this land 2 generations back. Caleb stood very still on the porch, rain running off the brim of his cap, and called for Wyatt to come listen. By the time his brother made it outside, the sound had stopped, and the 2 of them stood there in the rain, waiting, neither one saying what they were both thinking, which was that their grandfather had been dead for 6 years, and there was no earthly reason for anyone else on this property, or anywhere near it, to know that whistle at all. Wyatt's first thought, spoken out loud to break the silence more than anything, was that it must have been a bird, some mountain species that made a similar sound, something that carried strangely in the rain and the fog settling low over the ridge. It was a reasonable thing to say. Birds did make strange calls up here, especially in weather like this, and neither of them wanted the alternative explanation to be the first thing either of them landed on. Biscuit, still refusing to leave the truck bed, had started a low, steady growl aimed directly up toward the mine entrance, a sound the dog kept up long after both brothers had gone quiet and gone back inside, trying to convince themselves the whistle had been nothing more than an unfamiliar bird carried strange by rain and distance. Their grandfather had been dead 6 years. Nobody else knew that whistle. That was the thought neither of them said out loud that night, though it sat between them at the kitchen table while they ate dinner by lamplight, listening to the rain, and to a silence beneath it that neither of them wanted to admit they were listening for. It was their neighbor Earl who told them the rest of it the next morning, an old family friend who'd farmed the land down the holler from their grandfather for going on 50 years, and had known him longer than either brother had been alive. He came by around 8 with a thermos of his own coffee and a look on his face like he'd been expecting this conversation eventually. Maybe had been dreading it a little too. Caleb mentioned the whistle carefully, half expecting Earl to laugh it off, tell them it was some bird or trick of the wind carrying strange through the rain. Earl didn't laugh. He set his coffee down on the porch rail and was quiet for a moment before he spoke, choosing his words the way people do when they've decided to finally say something they've held back a long time. Your granddad used to tell us, "Don't answer that whistle past the second gate," Earl said, nodding up toward the tree line where the mine sat. Said that's not him answering back. Never would say more than that, not even when we pushed him on it. Just made us promise. Neither brother knew what to say to that. It was the kind of thing that should have sounded ridiculous in daylight, standing on a porch with coffee in hand and birds moving through the wet trees, and yet neither of them laughed either. Earl finished his coffee, told them to be careful, and left without offering anything further, the way people around here tended to do when a conversation had reached the edge of what they were willing to discuss. The truck wouldn't start that afternoon. Caleb turned the key 3 times, 4, getting nothing but a weak click from the starter, and when he popped the hood he found nothing obviously wrong. Battery connection solid, nothing corroded, nothing that should have kept the engine from turning over. It was the kind of failure that made sense on its own, but felt, given everything else, like one more small thing conspiring to keep them there. To make matters worse, the creek crossing at the bottom of the property, the only way out by vehicle, a low concrete ford that usually ran only inches deep, had swollen with the day's rain into something too fast and too high to risk crossing, even if the truck had started. They were, for all practical purposes, stuck for the night. It was Wyatt who found the mine entrance boarded shut that afternoon, walking the property line partly out of restlessness, and partly because some part of him needed to see it in daylight, needed to prove to himself there was nothing to it. The old mine mouth had always been boarded. That much wasn't new. What stopped him cold was the boarding itself. Fresh lumber, not weathered gray like everything else on the property, nailed across the opening in a pattern he recognized instantly, because he'd watched his grandfather build things his whole childhood and knew his particular way of doing it, the specific overlap of boards, the angle he always drove his nails, a signature as recognizable as handwriting. The mine had been reboarded, recently, in a style that matched a man who'd been dead for 6 years. He didn't tell Caleb until dinner, and when he did, his brother went very quiet, turning his fork over his plate without eating, both of them sitting with the same thought neither wanted to say out loud, that someone, or something, had gone up to that mine entrance after their grandfather's death and rebuilt it exactly the way he would have. The whistle came back that night, closer than before. Not from the mine entrance itself this time, but from somewhere just past it. The same 2 rising, falling notes, repeated with an exactness that made the hair on both their arms stand up. A rhythm too perfect to be anything but deliberate, too familiar to be anyone but him, and too impossible to actually be him at all. Neither of them answered it. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamps lit and the doors locked, listening to it repeat 2 more times before it finally went quiet, and the quiet afterward was worse than the sound had been, thick and expectant, the kind of silence that felt like it was waiting to see what they'd do next. They left at first light, the truck starting on the first try as though nothing had ever been wrong with it, the creek having dropped back down to its usual shallow trickle overnight. Before they pulled out, Caleb walked the yard one more time, unable to help himself, and found boot prints pressed into the mud near the porch steps, prints that matched, as close as he could tell without measuring, the size and wear pattern of his grandfather's old work boots, pairs of which still sat in a closet inside the cabin, untouched since the funeral. The prints were fresh, pressed into mud that had been rained on steadily through the night, which meant, if the mud told the truth, they'd been made sometime after the rain finally stopped. They sold the land within the year, neither of them able to say exactly why they wanted to be rid of it so quickly, beyond a shared, unspoken agreement that some places aren't meant to stay in a family too long after the person who anchored them there is gone. The buyer, according to Earl, reboarded the mine entrance himself not long after taking possession, sturdier this time, without anyone having to ask him to. Neither brother whistles anymore. Not at dogs, not at each other across a parking lot. Not even absently while doing chores the way people do without thinking. It's a small habit to lose, and neither of them talks about why they lost it. But if you ask Caleb directly, he'll tell you it just doesn't feel like something worth doing anymore. Not after that weekend. Not after learning that some sounds you love the most are exactly the ones you shouldn't answer. The next account is shorter, and it comes from a hunter whose family had worked the same ridge for 3 generations, who learned the hard way that a voice calling for help isn't always the thing it sounds like. His name was Grady, and the ridge he hunted had been in his family long enough that his grandfather had built the first tree stand on it by hand, back before anyone worried much about permits or property lines out this deep in the mountains. Grady had hunted it every fall of his adult life, knew every deer trail and creek crossing on that land better than he knew most of his own neighborhood, and had never once, in 20 years, felt anything but at ease up in that stand before dawn, with his coffee going cold in the thermos beside him. He'd gone out solo that morning, same as most mornings, leaving before sunrise while his wife was still asleep at home, 30 miles down the mountain. He liked the solitude of it, the particular quiet of a ridge waking up slow around him, deer moving through fog he couldn't quite see yet, birds starting up one at a time like they were taking turns. He climbed into his stand in the dark, settled his rifle across his knees, and let the woods do what they always did at that hour, which was mostly nothing, patiently, until something finally moved. The first voice came maybe 40 minutes after sunrise, distant, calling something that might have been his name, might have been nothing at all. Sound carries strange across a ridge like this, bouncing off rock faces and doubling back on itself until you can't always trust your own ears about where it started. He figured it for another hunter, somebody on the neighboring property maybe calling out to a partner, and he didn't think much more about it, settling back into the stillness of watching for movement in the tree line below. It came again 10 minutes later, closer this time, and there was no mistaking his name in it this time, called out clear and specific across the hollow. He still didn't think much of it. A lot of families hunted these ridges, and it wasn't unheard of for someone to know him by name and call out a greeting from a distance. The third time was different, and he knew it the instant it started. A cold certainty settling into his chest before his mind had even fully processed what he was hearing. It was his wife's voice, calling for help, close enough in tone, in pitch, in the specific cadence of how she said things when she was frightened, that his body was already halfway out of the stand before his brain caught up to the fact that his wife was 30 miles away, asleep in their bed, with absolutely no way to be anywhere near this ridge. He froze there, one boot on the ladder, heart going hard, listening as it called again. Her voice, unmistakable, pleading for help from somewhere down in the trees below the stand, close enough that every instinct in his body screamed at him to climb down and go to her. It was his father's rule that stopped him. Something drilled into him as a boy, repeated so many times across so many seasons on this same ridge that it had become instinct rather than memory. Never answer a voice on that ridge unless you can see the person calling it. His father had never explained why, not fully, only that it was a rule his own father had given him, and that men in this family had followed it for longer than anyone could account for. Grady climbed back into the stand instead of down it, hands shaking, and pulled his cell phone from his jacket, dialing his wife's number with fingers that didn't want to cooperate. She answered on the third ring, groggy, confused why he was calling this early, having no idea what he was talking about when he asked, voice cracking, if she was all right. She was fine. She was home. She'd been asleep until his call woke her. The voice called once more after that, from somewhere closer still, and this time when he didn't answer, when he sat frozen in the stand with the phone still pressed to his ear, and his wife's confused voice on the other end asking what was wrong. It simply stopped, all at once. No trailing off, no fading into distance the way a real voice would if the person calling had given up and walked away. Just silence, complete and immediate, as though something had been switched off. He stayed in that stand until well past his usual time to climb down, watching the tree line below with his rifle held tighter than it needed to be for anything he was actually hunting. When he finally worked up the nerve to climb down and check the ground beneath the stand, he found prints in the soft dirt, human in shape, close enough to a normal stride that his first read was simply that someone had been down there. It was the spacing that stopped him cold. The prints didn't match a single consistent gait. They shifted halfway through, as if whatever had made them had, partway across that stretch of ground, changed the way it walked. He told no one but his wife, sitting her down that evening and going through the whole thing slow and careful, half expecting her to think he'd finally cracked from too many early mornings alone in the cold. She didn't laugh it off. She'd grown up hearing pieces of this from his father before he passed. Half stories told at holiday dinners that nobody ever finished. Warnings passed down without full explanation the way most things get passed down in families that have worked the same land for generations. He still hunts that ridge. He couldn't imagine giving it up, not land his family had worked for 3 generations. But he doesn't hunt it alone anymore, not since that morning, and he's made himself one rule of his own to go along with his father's. He doesn't answer a voice he can't see, no matter whose it sounds like, no matter how close, no matter how much it sounds like someone who needs him. The next account comes from a woman who manages a family cabin rental, and what she found in an old guest book turned out to be the smallest and strangest thread in this whole collection. Her name was Renee, and the cabin had belonged to her family for 3 generations. A modest 2-bedroom place tucked into a stand of hemlocks that her grandparents had built by hand, and that her parents had eventually turned into a small rental business, the kind of side income that kept the property in the family, instead of letting it go the way so much mountain land eventually does. Renee had taken over managing it 5 years earlier, mostly handling the online listing, the cleaning between guests, the small maintenance issues that came up in a cabin old enough to have its own particular quirks. She was there on a Tuesday morning, the way she was every week between bookings, running through the routine that had become second nature by now, stripping the beds, running a load of linens, restocking the little welcome basket she kept by the door with local honey and a hand-drawn map of nearby trails. She swept the porch, checked the fridge for anything left behind, and settled onto the couch for a few minutes before her next task with the guest book in her lap, flipping through it out of habit more than necessity, something she did every visit as a small pleasure, reading strangers' handwritten thanks for a peaceful weekend. It was mostly what she always found. Families thanking her for the quiet, a young couple gushing about a proposal on the porch, someone's complaint about the mosquitoes written with more humor than real annoyance. She'd read this book cover to cover more times than she could count. But this time, flipping toward the most recent entries, she noticed something that had somehow never registered before. A page was torn out, cleanly, deliberately, right where the next entry should have started. She sat with that for a moment, and something nagged at her enough that she flipped backward through the older pages, back through years of guests, checking each section where a new season of bookings began. It was there every time. The same week, every single year, going back as far as the guest book itself went. A page torn free, always right at the same point in the calendar, always with that same clean, deliberate edge. She'd never noticed the pattern before because she'd never had reason to look for one. Once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. She told herself it was probably nothing more than coincidence, some recurring booking pattern, maybe the same family renting that same week year after year and always tearing out whatever they'd written for reasons of their own. It was a reasonable enough explanation, and she almost let it go at that. What kept her from letting it go was something she found later that evening, back home, scrolling through the cabin's online reviews out of idle curiosity after the guest book had lodged itself uncomfortably in her mind. Most of the reviews were glowing, the usual praise for a peaceful getaway. But buried in an older thread of comments, one she'd never noticed before, was a single review, vague and half-formed, that mentioned hearing the same knock during their stay, 3 nights in a row, and ended abruptly without much explanation. When she clicked to see the full review, the platform showed only a notice that the content had been removed for being not relevant to the listing. She sat with her laptop open a long time after that, the cursor blinking on an empty search bar, not entirely sure what she was even trying to find. She almost dismissed the whole thing as nothing, one strange coincidence stacked on top of another strange coincidence, the kind of pattern a person could talk themselves into seeing if they looked hard enough. Almost. It was her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, who lived a half-mile down the gravel road and had known the property since before Renee's grandparents built on it, who mentioned something a few days later that made the whole thing settle differently in Renee's mind. They were talking on Mrs. Pruitt's porch about nothing much, the cabin coming up only because Renee mentioned she'd been doing some cleaning, and the old woman said, almost offhand, that the land the cabin sat on had originally belonged to another family entirely, generations back, and that there'd been a small burial plot on the property that was never properly marked or moved when the land changed hands. Renee asked where exactly, and Mrs. Pruitt gestured vaguely toward the back corner of the property, near the tree line behind the cabin, an area Renee had always assumed was just unused woods. She didn't sleep well that night, turning the pieces over in her head, the torn pages, the deleted review, the unmarked plot, the same knock mentioned by guests across 10 years who had never met each other, never spoken to each other, never had any reason to compare notes on what they'd heard during their stay. The strange part wasn't any single piece of it. It was how neatly they all lined up when she finally let herself look at them together. A pattern that had been sitting in plain sight in her own family's guest book for years, waiting for someone to finally notice it. She decided, against what she'd later admit was probably good sense, to stay the night at the cabin herself, just once, just to see. She told herself it was practical. She managed the property. She should know firsthand if there was something worth addressing before it affected her guests. It was a reasonable justification, the kind you build for yourself when you already know you're going to do the thing regardless of whether it makes sense. She packed light, arrived a little before dusk, and did the routine things she always did when checking on the place, only slower this time, more deliberate, walking each room, running her hand along the walls out of some instinct she couldn't quite explain, standing a long moment near the back wall of the second bedroom, where, according to the pattern she'd traced, most of the knocking had apparently been reported over the years. Her phone had one bar of signal that flickered in and out depending on where she stood in the cabin, and the single road in was the same narrow gravel track her grandfather had cut decades earlier, unlit, unmarked, past the first quarter mile. She made tea, sat at the kitchen table with the guest book open in front of her, rereading old entries with fresh eyes now that she knew what she was looking for. Most of it was still exactly what it had always seemed. Happy families, grateful guests, nothing sinister in the ordinary entries at all. It was only the handful of oblique references, scattered years apart, easy to miss unless you were looking for them, that gave her pause. A line here about a funny noise the second night. A joke there about the cabin having its own heartbeat. Small, deniable things that guests had clearly decided not to make a bigger deal of, the way people do when they don't want to sound foolish in a guest book meant for cheerful memories. The knock came a little after 11, from the same back wall she'd stood near earlier. 3 slow raps, evenly spaced, exactly matching the rhythm described independently by 3 different reviews across a full decade. Reviews written by guests who had never met, never overlapped in their bookings, never had any way of comparing notes with each other. She sat very still at the kitchen table, tea going cold in her hands, listening as it repeated itself a minute later. And then, before she'd fully decided to do it, before some more careful part of her brain could stop her, she reached over and knocked back against the wall nearest her, once, out of an impulse that felt more like curiosity than courage. It answered instantly. No delay at all. The same single knock returned with a precision that made her hand freeze against the wall, her pulse suddenly loud in her own ears. Not an echo, not a coincidence of timing, a direct, immediate response, as though whatever was on the other side had been waiting for exactly that. She didn't knock again. She spent the rest of the night sitting upright at the kitchen table with every light in the cabin turned on, the guest book closed in front of her, listening to a silence that felt occupied rather than empty in a way she'd never noticed silence feel before. The knock didn't come back. She told herself that should have made her feel better. It didn't. Dawn came slow through the kitchen window, gray, then gold, and by the time full daylight had settled over the property, she'd convinced herself enough of the night's strangeness to finally step outside and look around the yard properly. Near the tree line behind the cabin, in the rough area Mrs. Pruitt had gestured toward days earlier, she found a patch of earth that looked disturbed. Not dramatically, nothing dug up or overturned, just a section of ground that sat slightly different from everything around it. Softer somehow, more recently settled. She didn't dig, she didn't touch it. She stood there a while, then went back inside and packed up her things. by the time she came back to check the property a season later, that patch of ground looked exactly like everything around it again. Indistinguishable, as though it had never been disturbed at all. She kept renting the cabin. It was her family's, after all, built by her grandparents with their own hands, and she wasn't willing to let one strange night undo 3 generations of what the place had meant to her family. But she added a single new line to the house rules on every listing after that, worded plainly enough that most guests probably read past it without much thought. If you hear knocking, please don't knock back. Guests still mention it occasionally in their reviews. The same rhythm, the same 3 slow raps from the same back wall, always described the same careful, half-embarrassed way people describe things they don't quite believe in, but still don't want to dismiss outright. Renee doesn't ask them to elaborate anymore. She reads their reviews, notes the pattern quietly to herself, and moves on to the next booking, the way she's learned to do with all of it now. The next account is the most difficult one in this whole collection, pieced together from a search and rescue radio log, a ranger's private account, and a hiker who survived without any memory of the parts that matter most. It started, as these things usually do out here, with someone who didn't check in on time. A hiker named Preston had told his roommate he'd be back from a solo day hike by 6 that evening, a route he'd done twice before on a section of trail that connected to an old fire road used mostly by maintenance crews and occasionally hunters willing to drive the rough grade. When 6 came and went, and then 9, and then midnight with no word and no answer on his phone, the roommate called it in, and by early morning a search and rescue team was assembling at the trailhead with a ranger named Holt coordinating the grid. Holt had worked search operations for the better part of a decade, long enough to know the rhythm of these things. Most missing hikers turned up within 12 hours, cold and embarrassed and telling a story about a twisted ankle or a wrong turn that had cost them daylight. He didn't expect this one to be any different. Not at first, though the storm that had rolled through the night before complicated things, washing out sections of trail and turning the fire road into something closer to a creek bed in places. The gear turned up around mid-morning on the fire road itself, roughly 2 miles in from where Preston's car had been found, parked at the trailhead. It stopped the whole search team cold the moment they saw it, laid out in a way that none of them liked. A pack sat upright at the edge of the road, unzipped but with everything still inside, nothing missing or disturbed. Beside it, a pair of boots, placed neatly, laces still tied, positioned, pointing uphill as though someone had stepped out of them deliberately, rather than lost them in a fall or a struggle. It looked staged, arranged, the kind of scene a person sets up when they want to be found, not the chaos you'd expect from an accident or an injury. Holt crouched beside the gear a long time, comparing the boot tread to photographs the roommate had provided of Preston's usual hiking boots, confirming the match while something in the back of his mind kept circling the same uncomfortable question. Why would someone in trouble take the time to arrange their belongings this carefully, instead of just leaving them where they fell? The team's first working theory was reasonable enough. Maybe Preston had set the gear out deliberately as a marker for rescuers, a signal meant to be found, before continuing on foot to find shelter or help elsewhere. It was the kind of thing survival training taught you to do. It fit the facts they had, even if something about the precision of it nagged at more than one member of the team. They pushed further up the fire road through the morning, radios crackling with routine check-ins, coffee going cold in thermoses balanced on dashboard consoles, boots sinking into mud that hadn't fully drained from the night's rain. It was slow, methodical work, the kind that requires patience more than urgency, cross-referencing the grid map against what little terrain features could help narrow the search. It was a little after noon when the radio produced something that made every person on that channel go quiet. A call came through, clear despite the static that had been plaguing the rest of the morning, using proper search protocol phrasing, giving coordinates, requesting confirmation of team positions. Standard stuff. Except it came through on a frequency the station had formally retired 2 years earlier, a channel nobody currently on the roster had any reason to be broadcasting on, using equipment that, as far as anyone present could account for, no longer existed in working condition anywhere in the district. Holt keyed his own radio, asked the caller to identify themselves, to repeat their unit designation. There was a pause, long enough that he thought the connection had dropped entirely. And then the same voice repeated the coordinates once more, calm, professional, giving no name, no unit number, nothing but the bare information a search team would need. Back at the station later, when Holt asked directly who had made that call, nobody claimed it. Nobody could explain it. The frequency itself had been officially decommissioned, its equipment either scrapped or sitting in storage, untouched, according to the inventory logs Holt pulled that afternoon with hands that weren't quite steady. Nobody at the station would admit to making that call. Nobody could have. That was the detail Holt kept coming back to over the following days, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. And it was the detail that told him, more than the arranged gear or the missing hiker himself, that this search was going to be different from every other one he'd run before. The search dog arrived a little after 1. A bloodhound named Sadie, handled by a volunteer who'd worked with the team for years, and for the first mile past the arranged gear she tracked steady and confident, nose down, tail working, the way a good dog does when the scent is clean and fresh. She stopped cold at a bend in the fire road where the trees pressed in close on both sides and the road itself narrowed to barely a single lane. Sat down. Refused every command her handler gave her to continue. Refused even the treat he offered to coax her forward. Just sat there staring past the bend with her ears back and a low, steady whine building in her throat. The handler, a quiet man named Reyes, who'd grown up in the county and volunteered with search and rescue for going on 15 years, crouched next to her a long moment before looking up at Holt. "She's never done this before," he said. "Not once, not in 15 years." They pushed on without her, leaving Reyes and Sadie back near the vehicles while the rest of the team continued the sweep past the bend. It was Reyes, though, quiet as he usually was, who offered the one piece of local knowledge that stuck with Holt for the rest of that day. "This road isn't supposed to be used after rain," he said, looking up the muddy grade ahead of them. "My grandfather wouldn't even drive it dry. Said the mountain doesn't like this stretch disturbed when the ground's soft." It was the kind of thing that sounded, on its face, like old superstition, the sort of thing families up here pass down about roads and trails without any concrete reasoning behind it anymore. But Reyes said it plainly, without embarrassment, the way a person states a fact rather than a rumor. And Holt found himself thinking about it more than he wanted to as the fog began rolling down off the ridge above them, thick and fast, swallowing the tree line within the space of 20 minutes. Radios started cutting to static not long after, the kind of interference that made coordinated communication nearly impossible. Teams reduced to shouting distances or relying on whistle signals instead. And the only bridge back across the creek that fed this section of the mountain, a low concrete crossing that had been dry that morning, had swollen with runoff faster than anyone anticipated, cutting off the easiest route back to the trailhead and forcing the team to plan an alternate path out before dark. It was deep into the afternoon, visibility dropping fast with the fog and the coming dusk, when one of the team members radioed in something that stopped the whole search cold for the second time that day. A whistle. Preston's whistle, according to the roommate's later confirmation, a specific plastic emergency whistle he'd carried clipped to his pack strap. Its pitch distinct enough that anyone who'd heard it before would recognize it again. It was coming from deep in a canyon section that ran below the fire road, a drop steep and unforgiving enough that surviving a fall into it without serious injury, let alone surviving a full night down there, seemed almost impossible. Holt made his way to the canyon rim with 2 other team members, straining to hear the whistle repeat, catching it twice more, faint but unmistakable, rising up out of the fog-choked drop below. There was no reasonable way anyone could have survived that fall and still be blowing a whistle with any strength a full day later. And yet, there it was. Steady, rhythmic. Exactly the kind of controlled signal a trained hiker would use if they were conscious and calling for help. Against every piece of protocol drilled into him over a decade of this work, against the explicit radio instruction from his own supervisor to hold position and wait for proper rope teams to be called in, Holt made the decision to go down alone at dusk, just far enough to confirm what he was hearing before committing full resources to a technical rescue that would take hours to organize. He told the others to hold the rim, radioed his intention in as clearly as the static would allow, and started down along the edge of the drop where the terrain allowed enough purchase to descend without full climbing gear, whistle guiding him lower with every faint rising blast. The fog had thickened enough by the time he was 30 feet down that he could barely make out the rim above him, let alone anything below, moving by feel more than sight, one careful handhold at a time, a long, wet rock that wanted badly to slide out from under his boots. The whistle kept guiding him, close now. Close enough that his mind kept insisting he must be nearly on top of whoever was making it. He reached a narrow shelf of rock roughly 60 feet down, a natural ledge wide enough to stand on, and it was there that the whistle stopped, all at once, mid-note, the way a sound cuts off when someone simply lowers their hand from their mouth rather than running out of breath. He stood on that ledge in the gray fog, breathing hard, calling Preston's name into the drop below, getting nothing back but his own voice swallowed by wet rock and mist. And it was then, turning to check his footing before continuing further down, that he saw it. A shape. Standing on a section of the canyon wall that had no ledge, no shelf, nothing that should have been able to support the weight of a standing person. A sheer vertical face of wet rock that dropped another 80 feet below where Holt stood. The shape was tall, still, facing him directly, visible only as a darker density within the fog rather than any clear outline. The kind of shape you catch and then immediately doubt you caught. Except Holt didn't doubt it. Not in the moment. Not even hours later when he tried to talk himself out of what he'd seen. He didn't call out to it. Some instinct older than his training told him, clearly and immediately, that calling out would be the wrong thing to do. The same instinct that had kept Grady from climbing down out of his tree stand. The same instinct that had kept a woman from knocking a second time on a cabin wall. He backed away from the edge of the ledge slowly, deliberately, not taking his eyes off the shape until the fog finally closed enough distance between them that it disappeared from view entirely. And then he climbed back up toward the rim faster than he'd descended, radioing the team the moment he was in range to call off the whistle track, to hold position, to wait for full daylight and proper equipment before anyone went down there again. Preston was found 2 days later, alive. Not in the canyon at all, but at the base of a completely different section of the mountain, nearly a mile from where his gear had been discovered. Disoriented and hypothermic but otherwise unharmed, having apparently wandered a considerable distance on foot before collapsing near a stream where a hunting party eventually spotted him. He had no memory of the fire road. None. When Holt sat with him at the hospital a few days later, gently walking him through the timeline the search team had pieced together, Preston insisted, calm and certain, that he had never gone anywhere near that section of trail, had taken a completely different route that morning than the one his own car's parking location suggested. He remembered starting his hike. He remembered vaguely a sense of being tired sooner than he should have been. And then he remembered almost nothing at all until waking up near the stream where he was found, cold and confused, with no explanation for how he'd gotten there or where the missing hours had gone. The gear, when the team went back to formally collect it as evidence, was exactly where it had been left, undisturbed, the boots still pointing uphill. Holt pulled the search log himself in the days that followed, needing to see the retired frequency's transmission documented in black and white, needing some kind of official confirmation that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. It was there, time-stamped, logged automatically by the station's recording system the way every transmission was, regardless of which channel it came through on. When he checked the equipment inventory for that decommissioned unit, it was exactly where it was supposed to be, in storage, off-site, untouched, with no possible way to have made a live transmission on any frequency at all. The official incident report, when it was finally filed, cited exposure and disorientation as the likely cause of Preston's missing hours, along with a note recommending the fire road be evaluated for further hazard closure given the unstable terrain and poor radio reception in that section. It was a reasonable explanation. It satisfied the paperwork. It didn't explain the retired frequency, or the whistle that had stopped mid-note, or the shape standing where no ledge existed to stand on. The station quietly stopped maintaining that fire road within the year, the official reasoning listed simply as erosion risk. Holt never discussed what he saw on that ledge with anyone beyond his direct supervisor, and even then, only once, in a conversation that ended with both of them agreeing, without quite saying it outright, not to bring it up again. He still works search and rescue in that district, but he never goes below a canyon rim alone anymore, no matter what he thinks he hears calling him down, and he's made sure every new recruit who trains under him understands the same rule before they ever set foot on a fire road after rain. The final account is the one that ties this whole collection together, the one that opened this video, and it comes from a family who learned that some warnings don't come with an explanation, only a rule, and a light that's never gone dark since. Sarah and her husband Mark had been talking about the move for over a year before Sarah's grandmother finally passed. And even after the funeral, even after the will named Sarah as the sole inheritor of the old homestead, it took another 6 months of practical hesitation before they finally committed to it. Their rented house in town wasn't getting any cheaper. Their 2 kids were young enough to adjust easily to a new school, and the property itself, sitting on nearly 40 acres at the end of a gravel road that wound up into the hills, offered a kind of space and quiet neither of them could afford anywhere else. It felt, at the time, like an easy decision. Practical, sentimental in a way that made the practicality easier to justify. They moved in on a bright Saturday in early fall, a truck full of boxes and furniture inching up the same gravel drive Sarah remembered from childhood visits, past a mailbox still labeled with her grandmother's name, because nobody had thought yet to change it. The house itself was modest but solid, a single-story farmhouse her grandmother had lived in for over 50 years, with a wraparound porch and a yard that backed up against a dense stand of trees at the property's edge. The first days were consumed with the ordinary business of moving, unpacking boxes, assembling the kids' beds, figuring out which kitchen drawer held the silverware and which held the junk nobody wanted to sort yet. Mark met their one nearby neighbor, an older man named Dale, who lived about a mile down the gravel road. A brief, friendly exchange over a fence line that ended with Dale offering to help if they ever needed anything. The kind of casual rural courtesy Mark hadn't experienced much of in town. It was on their third night, well after midnight, that Sarah woke to the porch light clicking on outside their bedroom window. She checked the clock out of habit more than concern. 3:17. She got up, peered through the curtain, saw nothing but the porch bulb glowing steady against the dark yard, its light ending in a soft border right at the edge of the tree line, and went back to bed assuming Mark had left it on by accident, or that the old switch was simply faulty. It happened again the next night. Same time. 3:17. Precise enough that she checked twice to be sure she wasn't misreading the clock. And the night after that, and the night after that, until it became a pattern too consistent to be the kind of random electrical hiccup either of them had assumed at first. Mark checked the switch himself during the day, flipping it on and off, tracing the wiring as far as he could without pulling anything apart. Everything looked ordinary. No visible fault, no obvious short. When he mentioned it to Dale over the fence line a few days later, half joking about needing an electrician, Dale's easy expression shifted into something more careful. "There's no timer on that switch," Dale said. "Your grandmother had one installed years back, then had it pulled out again not long after. Said she didn't need it anymore." He didn't elaborate on what he meant by that, and Mark, not wanting to push a new acquaintance too hard on what still felt like a minor quirk, let it drop. They called an electrician out the following week, a practical, no-nonsense man who spent the better part of an afternoon testing the wiring, the switch, the whole circuit from the breaker box to the fixture itself. He found nothing wrong. No fault, no short, nothing that would explain the light activating on its own at a precise time every single night without any timer mechanism installed to cause it. The electrician found nothing wrong with the wiring. That should have made Sarah feel better. It didn't. What unsettled her more than the timing itself, once she finally started paying closer attention, was the direction of the light. It wasn't a fixture that swiveled or adjusted. It was fixed, mounted flush against the porch eave, throwing its glow out across the yard in the same static cone it always had. And yet, every single night, without exception, that cone of light landed squarely on the same patch of trees at the edge of the property. The exact same section of tree line every time, as though the fixture itself had been mounted deliberately, decades ago, to illuminate that one spot and no other. She replaced the bulb herself one afternoon, a cheap screw-in bulb she picked up at the feed store 40 miles down the mountain. The same kind her grandmother had apparently always used, according to the half-empty box of spares she'd found in the hall closet. She thought, foolishly, that a fresh bulb might somehow break the pattern, reset whatever quirk had settled into the old fixture. It didn't. The new bulb turned on at 3:17 that very night, just like the old one had, casting its glow across the same patch of trees, steady and unbothered, as if it had simply been waiting for her to finish the task before resuming exactly where it had left off. Their dog, a mixed shepherd named Copper, who'd taken to the property well enough during the day, started refusing the back porch entirely once the sun went down. It happened gradually enough that neither of them noticed the pattern at first, a reluctance here, a whine there, until one evening, about 2 weeks in, when Mark opened the back door to let Copper out for his usual nighttime routine, and the dog simply wouldn't go. He stood in the doorway, ears back, a low growl building steady in his throat, staring fixed toward that same patch of tree line the porch light always illuminated, and no amount of coaxing, treats, or gentle pushing would get him to step past the threshold. It became the new normal within a matter of days. Copper would use the front yard without hesitation, would sit happily on the porch itself during daylight hours. But the moment dusk settled in, he wouldn't go anywhere near the back steps, growling low at that same fixed point in the trees every single night, as consistent and precise as the porch light itself. Sarah brought it up with Dale again, catching him at his mailbox one afternoon, and this time he was more forthcoming, though still careful in the way he chose his words. "Your grandmother used to leave a bowl of water out on the back step," he said. "Every night without fail, far back as I can remember. Never asked her why, but I never once saw her miss a night, not even in the worst weather." Sarah asked carefully if he knew what it was for. Dale just shook his head, said he genuinely didn't know, that her grandmother had never explained it to anyone, as far as he was aware, and that most folks around here had learned a long time ago not to ask too many questions about habits like that. "Some things," he said, "people just do because it's what's always been done. Doesn't always come with a reason." Sarah started leaving the water bowl out that same week, mostly out of a strange, quiet impulse she couldn't fully explain. Some inherited sense that this was simply a task now hers to carry on. She told herself it was harmless, a small nod to her grandmother's memory, and didn't mention it to Mark right away, not because she was hiding it, but because it felt private in a way she hadn't expected. Cell service on the property was unreliable at best. One bar if you stood in exactly the right spot near the kitchen window, nothing at all anywhere else in the house. It hadn't bothered them much during the day-to-day business of moving in, but as the nights grew longer and the strange habits of the house piled up one on top of another, Sarah found herself more aware of just how far they were from anyone. Dale's place, a full mile down a gravel road that had no streetlights at all. The nearest town another 20 minutes past that. It was the kids who gave them their first real scare, on a Saturday afternoon while they were playing near the edge of the yard, well within the boundary Sarah and Mark had set for how far they were allowed to go without an adult. Their daughter, 7 years old, came running up to the porch a little breathless, telling her parents that a man had waved at her from the trees, and that she and her brother had waved back before deciding, on their own, that it was time to come inside. Sarah's stomach dropped the moment she heard it. She questioned her daughter carefully, gently, the way you do when you don't want to plant fear but need the real answer. What did he look like? Was he close? Did he say anything? Her daughter's answers were vague in the frustrating way a child's answers always are, unable to describe much beyond he was standing kind of still, and he had on a coat like Grandpa used to wear, a detail that meant nothing to a 7-year-old and everything to Sarah, whose grandfather had died before she was even born, whose grandmother had lived alone on this property for decades without any man in that particular kind of coat anywhere in recent memory. Mark walked the tree line himself that evening before dark. Found nothing, no footprints, no sign anyone had been standing there at all. The ground dry and undisturbed exactly where the kids had pointed. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it sat heavy in both their chests through dinner, through bath time, through the quiet ritual of tucking their kids into bed with the porch light not yet on, still hours from 3:17, the house settling into the ordinary dark of a night that no longer felt entirely ordinary at all. It was Sarah who noticed the water bowl wasn't behaving the way she expected, about a week after she'd started the habit herself. She'd taken to filling it fresh each evening before bed and checking it again first thing in the morning, mostly out of curiosity to see how much, if any, actually evaporated or got lapped up by some passing animal overnight. Most mornings it sat close to where she'd left it, water leveled down slightly, consistent with whatever wildlife wandered through after dark. But twice now, she'd found it moved. Not spilled, not knocked over, the way an animal drinking clumsily might do. Moved, sitting several inches from where she'd placed it the night before, positioned with what looked like deliberate care rather than accident, sometimes closer to the steps, once nearly at the edge of the porch itself. She mentioned it to Mark carefully, watching his face for the same unease she felt building in her own chest, and found it there, mirrored back at her, neither of them quite ready to say out loud what they were both starting to suspect, that whatever her grandmother had been doing this for all those years hadn't stopped just because her grandmother had. It was Mark who found the photograph, digging through a box of her grandmother's things in the attic one rainy afternoon while the kids napped downstairs. It was old, black and white, curling at the edges the way photographs from that era do, showing the same yard, the same tree line, taken from what looked like the same angle as the porch itself, decades before either of them had been born. And there, faint but unmistakable once you knew to look for it, was a pale shape standing between two of the trees, indistinct enough that it could have been a trick of light or a smudge on the film, except for the small, deliberate circle drawn around it in fading pen, clearly added sometime after the photo was developed, clearly done by someone who had wanted to remember exactly where to look. Mark brought it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table without a word, and Sarah stared at it a long time, running her thumb along the edge of that circled shape, feeling something settle into place that she didn't have words for yet. She caught Dale at his mailbox again a few days later, and this time she brought the photo with her, showed it to him directly, watched his face carefully as he studied it. He didn't seem surprised by the image itself, only by the fact that Sarah had found it. He was quiet a long moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was finally deciding to say the thing he'd been holding back since that first conversation over the fence. "Your grandmother had one rule," he finally said. "Never let that porch light go dark before sunrise, no matter what. Storm, power outage, didn't matter. She kept a lantern, kept spare bulbs, kept candles by the door, whatever it took. I asked her once why it mattered so much. She just said some things you keep lit and you don't ask why, you just keep them lit." He handed the photo back without offering anything further, and Sarah didn't push, understanding by now that pushing rarely got her anything more than Dale was willing to give on his own terms. The storm rolled in 2 nights later, a hard, sustained system that knocked the power out across the whole gravel road sometime around 10 in the evening, plunging the house into a darkness thick enough that Sarah found herself moving through it by memory and feel, gathering candles and the box of matches she kept in the kitchen drawer, more out of instinct than any real plan. Mark found the lantern in the hall closet, an old kerosene one that had clearly belonged to her grandmother, sitting there as though it had been kept ready and waiting, fuel still in the reservoir, wick trimmed and usable despite years of apparent disuse. He lit it without a word, both of them thinking the same thing without needing to say it, and carried it out to the front room where they gathered with their kids, candles flickering across the walls, wind driving hard against the windows. The power didn't come back that night. It didn't come back the following night either, the outage stretching longer than either of them expected, the storm having taken down lines somewhere further up the mountain that the utility company wouldn't reach for a full 2 days. Sarah kept the lantern burning low but steady in the front window through both nights, remembering Dale's words, remembering the circled shape in that old photograph, unwilling to let it go dark even for the short stretch it would take to refill it, timing her refills carefully so the flame never fully died even for a moment. She didn't know, not with any certainty, what exactly they were keeping lit for or why, but something in her, Some inherited instinct passed down without explanation, the way so much in this family apparently had been. Told her it mattered more than she could fully account for. And that was enough for now, to keep her filling that lantern through 2 long, dark, storm-driven nights, listening to wind move through trees she could no longer see at all. With the porch light dark for the 2nd straight night, Mark carried the lantern out to the back steps himself a little before midnight, setting it on the railing in roughly the same spot the fixed bulb always threw its glow. Some instinct telling him the light itself mattered more than its source. That the point was illumination on that patch of trees, not the specific mechanism providing it. He hadn't expected what happened next, and he'd say later, when he finally talked about it at all, that it was the moment everything before it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something closing in around them for real. The shape came closer under the lantern than it ever had under the fixed bulb. Not fully visible. Nothing about it ever became fully visible. Not that night or any night after, but close enough now that Mark could make out something that resolved, briefly, into an almost human silhouette between 2 of the nearest trees. Closer to the yard's edge than the tree line itself. Closer than anything had ever dared come under the steady electric glow of the porch fixture. He didn't call out. He backed inside slowly, lantern still burning on the railing where he'd left it, deciding in that moment it was safer to leave it lit and exposed than to bring it back inside and risk even a few seconds of full darkness while he crossed back to the door. It was maybe 20 minutes later. Both kids tucked into the same bed for comfort. Sarah and Mark sitting together in the front room with every candle they had going, that they heard it. Their son's name. Called softly from somewhere near the back of the house. Gentle, almost affectionate. The kind of tone a favorite relative might use calling a child in for dinner. Correct, precise. Said with a familiarity that made Sarah's blood run cold, because there was no reasonable way for anything out there to know that name, let alone say it with that particular warmth, that particular ease. Their son stirred in his sleep at the sound of it, murmuring something, and Mark was across the room before Sarah had even fully processed what she'd heard, standing at the bedroom door like a wall between his children and whatever was calling from outside. "Nobody answers," he said, low, more to himself than to Sarah, though she nodded anyway, understanding without needing further explanation. Every warning Dale had given them over the past weeks came rushing back at once, disjointed pieces suddenly assembling into something that made a terrible kind of sense. The light that was never supposed to go dark, the water that was never supposed to stop, the rule about not answering, layered now on top of every warning from every other story. Either of them had half remembered hearing growing up in these mountains. Stories about voices that knew names they shouldn't, about things that tested a boundary gently before testing it harder. The voice called again, twice more, patient, unhurried, never rising, never growing frantic the way a real emergency would sound. That patience was, somehow, worse than urgency would have been. It didn't sound like something trying to lure a frightened child outside through fear. It sounded like something that had all the time in the world, that had perhaps been calling names from that tree line for longer than any of them could imagine, waiting each time for someone, eventually, to answer. Mark sat on the floor outside his children's door for the rest of that night, back against the wall, listening for any sound from inside the room, listening equally hard for anything more from outside. Sarah kept the candles burning in the front room, refusing to let even one gutter out, glancing every few minutes toward the small orange glow visible through the kitchen window where the lantern still burned steady on the back railing, holding its ground against the dark yard beyond it. The voice didn't call a fourth time, but the silence that followed carried the same weight it always seemed to carry in these accounts. Not an absence, but a kind of patient waiting. The sense of something settling back to watch from just beyond the reach of the light, content, for now, to wait for another night. Mark moved out to the back porch himself once the last candle in the front room had burned down close to its base, unwilling to let the lantern stand alone through the rest of the night after everything that had happened. He carried a folding chair out, set it near the railing where the lantern still burned, and settled in with a blanket around his shoulders and his eyes fixed on that same patch of trees the porch light had always illuminated. The same spot circled in fading pen on a photograph decades old. He didn't speak. He'd decided that much on his own. Some instinct telling him silence was the only safe posture left to him now. The same instinct that had kept a hunter from climbing down out of his stand, that had kept a ranger from calling out into a fog-choked canyon. He sat with the lantern's small orange glow the only light in the whole dark yard, refilling it once around 2 a.m. with hands that shook only slightly, careful never to let the flame dip low enough to gutter, careful never to look away from the tree line for longer than the refill absolutely required. Nothing approached directly. Nothing called out again. But there were long stretches through that night when Mark would later swear the darkness beyond the lantern's small circle of light felt occupied rather than empty, a sense of being watched that never fully let up, punctuated occasionally by a soft shift of movement just beyond where the light could reach, gone the instant he turned his head toward it. He stayed there until the sky began to lighten, gray creeping in slow behind the ridgeline, the kind of dawn that always seems to take longer than it should when you've been waiting for it all night. Copper, who'd spent the night pressed against the inside of the back door, finally relaxed enough to lie down flat against the floor sometime around 5. And Mark took that small shift in the dog's posture as the closest thing to reassurance he was going to get. Full daylight arrived a little before 7, and it was Sarah who came out first to find him still sitting there, lantern burned down low but still lit, his eyes red from the sleepless night, staring at something on the ground near the bottom of the steps. The water bowl sat empty at the very edge of the tree line, moved fully off the porch this time, further than it had ever moved before, positioned precisely at the boundary where lawn gave way to trees. And leading up to it, pressed into the dew-heavy grass, was a single set of small, human-shaped prints, barefoot, walking toward the bowl in a clean, unbroken line. There were no prints leading away. Sarah stood over them a long time, the morning cold settling into her bones in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, counting the prints, checking twice to be sure she wasn't miscounting, finding the same result each time. Whatever had walked up to that bowl overnight had, as far as the ground could tell them, simply stopped there. No trail back into the trees. No sign of it turning around. Just a line of prints ending at the exact spot where the bowl now sat, as though whatever made them had simply ceased to need footprints once it reached where it was going. The power came back on later that morning, the utility trucks finally clearing the downed lines further up the mountain, and with it came an electrician. Mark called out of what he now understood was less an inconvenience and more a genuine need, asking the man to replace the entire porch fixture from scratch, wiring and all, top to bottom, no shortcuts. The new fixture went in that afternoon. Fresh wiring, a brand new switch, everything installed to the electrician's exact specifications. No old parts left behind. Nothing that could explain any lingering fault from before. It turned on at 3:17 that night anyway, exactly on schedule, casting its steady glow across the same patch of trees it always had, as though the house itself, or something beyond the house, had simply decided this was how things were going to be, regardless of what wiring carried the current. They never did figure out exactly what her grandmother had been keeping lit all those years, or what the water was meant to satisfy, or why a family who'd lived quietly and practically on this land for decades had built an entire private ritual around one patch of trees at the edge of their yard. Sarah asked Dale directly, one last time, sitting on his porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them, whether he knew, really knew, what her grandmother had seen out there to start any of this in the first place. He was quiet a long moment, looking off toward the ridge the way he always did when a question landed somewhere he didn't want to go. "She never told me," he finally said. "Just told me not to stop." That was all he offered, and Sarah understood by then that it was likely all anyone was ever going to get. They kept the light burning every night without exception after that. Not because either of them had decided they believed in anything specific, but because neither of them was willing to find out what happened if they let it go dark, and it mattered after all. Sarah refilled the water bowl each evening the same way her grandmother had, the same way she now assumed her grandmother's own mother might have before her, an inherited habit passed down not through explanation, but through the simple, unbroken continuation of doing it, night after night, regardless of season or weather. The kids stopped playing near that edge of the yard once dusk started settling in, an unspoken boundary they'd absorbed without either parent needing to spell it out directly, the same way children learn which parts of a house creak and which stairs to avoid without ever being formally told. Sarah kept a spare bulb in the kitchen drawer at all times now, replacing it well before the old one ever had a chance to burn out, unwilling to risk even a single night of the fixture sitting dark and unlit while she waited for a trip to the feed store 40 miles down the mountain. Copper still won't cross the back threshold after dark, not once, not even years later, sitting instead at the door with his ears low and his eyes fixed on that same patch of trees, the same low growl building in his throat every single evening like clockwork, right around the time the sky finishes going dark. The light still turns on at 3:17, every morning, facing the same patch of woods it always has, steady and unbothered, throwing its small cone of glow out across a yard that looks, in every other respect, completely ordinary. And some mornings, if you happen to be standing close enough when the light first clicks on, you'll notice the grass near the tree line sitting flattened in a small patch, pressed down the way grass gets pressed down when something has been standing there a while, waiting, patient, for the light to come back on. Sarah doesn't investigate it anymore. She stopped asking the questions she used to ask, stopped searching for old photographs, or pressing Dale for anything more than he's willing to give. She simply keeps the light on, keeps the water filled, and goes about her mornings the way her grandmother did before her, and her grandmother's mother before that, carrying forward a small, quiet ritual whose full meaning may have died with the first person who ever felt the need to start it.